Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Sonia Winkleman, and I'm the Director of Net Zero Energy Housing at the Canadian Home Builders Association. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping items to cover off, so I'll just go through a few slides. Oh, sorry, you can probably hear my dog chewing on her rawhide behind me here. The first slide I'm going to go over is just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. So CHBA members will be able to access the recording as well as the slide deck at chba.ca/netzerowebinars or NZ webinars, sorry. You'll be in listen only for the duration of the webinar, but we will have time for questions after the presentation. So please use the question section of the dashboard throughout the webinar, and I will relay those questions to the presenters. One other thing I want to let you know is if you hover your mouse over the very top right-hand corner of the Zoom screen, a little view icon will come up. If you click on that, you'll be able to modify what you see. So if you want to see the speaker only or the gallery or a standard view, you can change all of that at that button at the top there. Also wanted to take this opportunity to thank our silver sponsor, Owens Corning, for all of the great work that they do. And you'll be able to find more on their building science team on our website, as well as at owenscorning.ca. There's some information on the team on the screen there. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to also thank our other sponsors, All Weather Windows, BASF, Enbridge, Fortis BC, and Panasonic. The next screen is about our next webinar. We will be having a webinar on June 15th about indoor air quality and the CHBA Net Zero homes. What do they deliver? So we're going to have Brett leading that conversation, along with Gord Cook, Doug Terry, and Sunny Parada from Panasonic are all going to be on that webinar. And they're going to talk about the concerns about indoor air quality and comfort and energy costs. Of course, those have been raised continuously throughout 2020, amplified by the pandemic. Due to this heightened awareness, our technical committee has taken a closer look at the aspects in our program that help to achieve one of our key brand promises, which is exceptional indoor air quality for healthier living. So please join us for this webinar to learn more about why indoor air quality is so important, the key control strategies, as well as how net zero homes are able to deliver better indoor air quality than a code-built home. You can register for that webinar after this webinar concludes at chba.ca/NZ webinars. So we do have a webinar, we do have for today's webinar coming up. Obviously, you're well aware of the topic as you registered. So we're going to talk today about how the CHBA homes measure up to the proposed NBC Tier 5. Brett and Liz have put together a great presentation for you. And we've got also some wonderful insight from our net zero builders who were surveyed as well. And they'll be able to give you some more insight as to what the net zero builders think about the differences between how our program does net zero ready and what's being proposed. Before we begin, I did want to also start a poll here just to see who's in our audience today. So that should be coming up on your screen now. So we're looking to find out how many of you are builders, renovators, developers, trade contractors, suppliers, manufacturers, whether or not you offer professional services, if you're into the financial or insurance industry, or government or a local or provincial EO or staff. I'm going to give everyone a few more minutes here to see if we can get some more participation in the vote. Okay, it looks like about 62% of you voted and things have slowed down. So I'm just going to share the results. And it looks like the majority of participants today are builders. But we do also have a great representation of folks here from the government, which doesn't surprise me given the nature of the topic for today's webinar. So without further ado, we will give the microphone over to Mr. Brett Cass, and I will see you folks later during the question and answer section of the webinar.
Great. Well, thanks, Sonia. And as mentioned, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the analysis of our CHBA net zero and net zero ready homes perform in comparison to the proposed code tiers. It will be a relatively technical webinar and we're going to show lots of charts. So we'll try to take it slow. If you do have any questions, please do bring those up towards the end. Because we will have about 15 or 20 minutes to go back and review and make sure we clarify everything we've discussed. So let's jump right in. CHBA's Net Zero Home Labeling Program is a voluntary set of technical requirements builders can follow to show that their homes either generate more energy than they use, or could if a modest PV system were installed later. The program has been operational since 2015, and in that time, we're proud to say we've had over 600 homes achieve either the Net Zero or the Net Zero Ready label. Codes Canada have been developing prescriptive and performance-based energy tiers as part of the CCBFC long-term energy strategy. At the outset, the intent was that the top tier would be equivalent to Net Zero energy ready homes. Lower tiers would be equivalent to other less stringent voluntary programs. Today's presentation focuses on the performance path, since for tier 5, a prescriptive path has not yet been established. Because the codes do not deal with renewables, a formal definition of Net Zero energy ready was never officially adopted. However, to inform the development of the tiered codes, a working definition was developed by the Standing Committee on Energy Efficiency, SKI, which states, a net zero energy ready building is a building with a high performance envelope whose annual energy requirements are minimal and could be offset by renewable energy. To our knowledge, no precise energy intensity or percent improvement targets was formally chosen as representative. In the absence of a precise definition, it would seem reasonable when setting tier 5 to look at the performance of homes in an existing labeling program that aims for net zero energy. In the code meetings where the tiers were drafted, no data on the CHBA Net Zero Ready home performance was reviewed. Metrics were chosen based on what members thought should be considered, and they used their estimates of how well the net zero energy homes would perform in order to set the tier 5 code targets. Only after the proposed tiers went to public review was validation done to check that the tier 5 code targets looked to be about right. And even then, no adjustments were made to the targets, since some CHBA net zero homes appeared to comply. Since that review, the code requirements and metrics have been changed further. This presentation will summarize how CHBA labeled net zero ready homes compared to the tiers as currently proposed. So, what are the high level technical requirements to get a CHBA net zero or net zero ready label? Firstly, this is an EnerGuide based program, so the homes are modeled using the EnerGuide rating system procedures. Energy is calculated and it includes lighting and appliances. In order to get a net zero label, the predicted energy used annually by a home must be so small that it can be offset by the energy generated by on-site renewables, which have actually been installed. On the other hand, a net zero ready label is available for those who have not installed renewables, but have demonstrated that there is capacity to install sufficient generation at a future date to meet the full net zero requirements. In addition to this high level requirement, in order to encourage an efficient building envelope, all labeled homes must demonstrate that both an air tightness target is met, as well as an envelope efficiency target is met. The air tightness target for CHBA net zero and net zero ready homes is 1.5 air changes per hour at 50 pascals for detached homes and 2.0 for attached homes. It's important to note that most homes from our data go beyond that, but these are the minimum thresholds. The envelope efficiency target for the CHBA net zero program is set at 33% better than the reference house. The methodology for our program looks at the space heating energy load, which must be, using a standardized heating system to normalize this calculation, at least 33% lower than that of the reference house. Keeping in mind that this is not the same as the envelope metric methodology used by the codes, more on that shortly. One more requirement of note with respect to air conditioning. If air conditioning is not provided, it must be demonstrated that the house uses less than a fixed annual cooling load per meter cubed. And if this is not met, the house must be modeled with a basic air conditioning unit as an energy penalty to account for the possible additional future load. In most net zero homes and net zero ready homes, air source heat pumps seem to be installed. So in most cases, this requirement does not need to be met. So looking at our requirements, in other words, This program requires builders to prove a high performance envelope and minimal annual energy consumption, which can be offset by renewable energy. To me, that seems to meet the working definition agreed to by SKI. Now we'll briefly outline the tier code requirements. The tier code uses a proposed versus reference approach, which means that all design criteria require the proposed home performance to be compared against a reference model with similar geometry, defined mostly by prescriptive minimum codes and some additional modeling assumptions. While CHBA defines that HOT 2000 is the only acceptable simulation tool for our voluntary program, the codes are intended to be simulation tool agnostic. So the reference house approach was chosen to level the playing field for different energy simulation tools, which might generate different absolute values for energy on the same house, but are likely to be much closer together at modeling improvement of that house over a reference. If you guide your eyes to the bottom right of the screen, there's a chart that shows the tiers and the three main requirements within the tiers, all three of which must be met to qualify for a code tier. So first, starting with the code targets for envelope improvement. This target represents the heat loss through the envelope via conduction, air leakage, and ventilation. It needs to be less than that of a reference house set out for each tier. There is no envelope target at tier 1. And note that this envelope metric is a little different than the net zero approach, as mentioned. Second, the code target for energy improvement. For this, the total energy use for heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and hot water needs to be less than that of the reference house by a percentage set out for each tier. You can see those percentages listed in the boxes. Third, there's the peak cooling load, which is usually modeled on the hottest day, has to be less than or equal to the reference house's peak cooling load. It's important to note that this cooling load threshold is a prerequisite for achieving any tier, not just tier 5. You can see a check mark in each box to show that it must be met as a pass-fail for each tier. Now, touching on the additional details in the top right. An adjustment to the modeling assumptions for tiers permits the full benefit of heat pumps used in space heating to be claimed. There are some additional details which allow relaxations for homes smaller than 300 cubic meters and which provide an energy penalty for not testing air tightness. These are important items, but not relevant for today's discussion. For most homes, the percent targets are shown in the table. The key thing to remember for this presentation is that for tier 5, envelope improvement must exceed 40%. Energy improvement must exceed 70%, and the cooling criteria must be met. The HOT 2000 files submitted for CHBA net zero labeling use a different set of assumptions than those required for the tier code. We needed to run the homes using the proposed code assumptions so that we could accurately understand how net zero and net zero ready labeled homes would have performed. To do this, NRCan's Office of Energy Efficiency and CanMet Energy staff kindly assisted us by using their housing technology assessment platform known as HTAP to automate this process for 447 net zero or net zero ready labeled homes. The photovoltaic panels used to go from net zero ready to full net zero were not included in this analysis because the code does not consider them. With the PV removed, these homes are effectively net zero ready, so we'll refer to them as such throughout this presentation. The results were shared with Liz and I, and we used the data to perform the analysis that follows. So Liz will tell us more about this analysis.
Thanks, Brett. Here's the headline. When comparing CHBA net zero ready homes performance levels to the current proposed NBC, only 9% of homes assessed met all three of the proposed tier 5 requirements. 44% met no tier at all. As we pointed out earlier, tier 5 was intended to align with net zero energy ready, so this might be a bit surprising. Let's have a look at each requirement individually. First, we'll look at the envelope improvement. In this chart, we are comparing the CHBA net zero ready homes performance levels to the currently proposed NBC tier code, looking specifically at the envelope improvement targets. At a high level, About 50% of net zero ready homes meet the envelope target of 40% improvement in gross space heat loss for Tier 5. Most of the rest met Tier 4 target of 20% improvement, while 4 were below that. We decided to look in more detail at how well the homes were doing to see how close those not reaching Tier 5 were to the target. This chart shows the distribution of the tier code envelope performance for the CHBA net zero ready homes. The x-axis shows the percentage envelope improvement, while the y-axis shows the number of homes at that level of improvement. For those interested, we use 2% buckets to make this chart readable. Most of the homes achieving Tier 4 are actually much closer to the Tier 5 target than the Tier 4 target. Most of the homes reaching Tier 5 did not exceed the 40% target by very much. Most of the homes, 96% of the homes analysed would have met a target of 30% improvement, while 89% would have met a target of 35%, shown by the dotted line. Remember that the CHBA Net Zero programme and the code do not have the same envelope metric methodology. The chart on the right shows the percentage improvement for the data set measured using both CHBA's and the code's approach as a comparison. You can see that scores are generally lower using the code metric. Note also that most of the homes significantly exceed the 33% improvement required of the CHBA programme, with an average of over 50%. This is a strong correlation between the two, with the code line taller and narrower than the CHBA programme line, but with similar profiles. Let's move on now to the energy improvement. Here again, we are comparing the CHBA Net Zero Ready Homes performance levels to the currently proposed NBC. Now, looking at the energy improvement targets only. We can see that nearly 3/4 of the net zero ready homes do not meet the Tier 5 targets of 70% improvement over reference. Before we draw conclusions, let's again look at the data in more detail. This chart uses the same methodology as the envelope chart. Again, this shows that the net zero ready homes are performing significantly above the Tier 4 threshold of 40% improvement. But 70% improvement seems to be a little bit beyond what has proven to be practical for most net zero builders. Remember that the CHBA Net Zero programme does not set a specific energy improvement target, only requiring that you can offset it with renewables, so some spread here is to be expected. You can see that 74% of the homes met the Tier 4 energy target, and that 26% of the homes met the Tier 5 energy target. There was also an interesting collection of data around 50 to 60% improvement. This is dominated by homes built by one builder, which suggests that an effective means of meeting net zero has been found, which allows a greater proportion of energy to be offset by PV. 88% of the homes analysed would have met a target of 60% improvement, while 72% would have met a target of 65%, shown by the dotted line. Moving on now to the cooling requirement. Remember, it states that to meet any tier, the peak cooling load for the proposed house must not be greater than the peak cooling load for the code reference house. Over half of the homes analysed would meet the criteria, but 44% did not. This explains the 44% in our first pie chart, which did not achieve any tier. In the Net Zero programme, the cooling requirements do not apply if air conditioning is provided. That is not the case with the tier code criteria. Remember, our net zero builders were not trying to meet this requirement when building their homes, and they may be able to meet it in future homes with some changes to the strategy. Let's see how close the homes were. This graph shows peak cooling load as a percentage of the reference house peak cooling load. Like the other graphs, the y-axis shows the number of homes at that respective cooling load. Unlike the other graphs, performance decreases from left to right. Any homes to the left of the red line on the green background have a lower cooling load than the reference house and are therefore eligible for tiers. Any homes to the right of the red line on the pink background failed on this criterion. You can see that most homes that didn't pass were only 5 to 10% over the target. Hoping to understand why only 9% of the net zero ready homes reach Tier 5, we combined all three requirements in one chart. Each dot on this chart refers to an individual net zero ready home and how they performed on the envelope, energy, and cooling criteria of the tiered code. Envelope performance is the bottom scale and increases from left to right. Energy performance is the left scale and increases from bottom to top. Homes that met the cooling requirement are shown in blue, while orange dots represent homes that did not meet the cooling requirement. You can see that there's no obvious trend to which homes meet the cooling requirement on these metrics. The data here shows all homes. We decided to also look at data from builders who had built a large number of net zero ready homes to find out if that gives us any insight on where cost-effective, marketable solutions would fall. These builders have had time to refine their approach and presumably optimize for cost, which one-off custom projects may not have. In this chart, we show only homes by builders who have completed more than 10 labeled homes. None of the remaining builders consistently met all requirements of Tier 5 in all their labeled homes. We can see that most of these homes exceeded 60% energy improvement and 35% envelope improvement. Compared to the full dataset, there is a noticeable clumping of energy and envelope improvement at the high end of Tier 4. This suggests that this region represents a cost-effective, marketable approach to net zero ready, which is relatively repeatable. Envelope improvement is quite variable within a given builder's data when compared to energy, which may be due to variations in air tightness and form. There still seem to be a lot of this group failing the cooling requirement. We'll come back to that later. We wanted to see how representative these builders were of more typical home construction in Canada. Here, we looked at the typical size and type of house being built in this reduced sample. As you can see, most were between 400 and 1100 meters cubed. 65% of the homes were single-family detached, with the remaining 35% made up of a good spread of attached house types. Last month, we sent out an optional survey to our qualified net zero builders and renovators, as well as our Net Zero Council builder and renovator members. Among other topics, we wanted to hear their views on this data. Brett will take us through the survey results on the tier code aspect.
So the survey was fairly technical and focused on a handful of aspects that both the CHBA Net Zero Home Labeling team and the CHBA's TRC, the Technical Research Committee team, were interested in hearing from our net zero builders about. In this analysis, we'll look at the responses from these builders. The survey was completed online and the builders did not see the entire data analysis from this presentation in long form, although they did receive a description of each chart before providing a response to a directed question. The builders were surveyed on their opinions of the 4 charts above, the same charts that we reviewed earlier. So what was the makeup of this group of builders? Well, 25 of the 27 respondents are qualified net zero builders or renovators. The 2 that answered no are working to become qualified. The builders represent 7 provinces from across Canada, with the majority coming from Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta. And this comes as no surprise to us as it aligns really well with where our net zero homes are typically built. It's important to remember as we look at these results that this survey sample group is not representative of the general builder membership or industry at large across Canada. This is a sample of the industry leaders who have experience in net zero residential construction. We also wanted to see what level of knowledge these builders have with respect to the ongoing development of the code tiers in the 2020 NBC. We know that some of the builders are very involved, whereas others are not. And we wanted to get a better understanding of the overall knowledge characteristics of our respondents. So we asked, on a scale of 1 to 5, how closely have you been following the development of the proposed changes for energy efficiency in the upcoming 2020 NBC, with 1 representing, I have not been keeping up with the proposed changes, and 5 representing, I have been thoroughly engaged with the proposed changes. As you can see, we saw quite a variety of responses here. We then aim to take a closer look at the opinions of each of the respondents on the individual metrics that make up each tier: envelope, energy, and cooling criterion, specifically looking at where their net zero ready experience lies with tier 5. We started with the code envelope chart that we looked at earlier in this presentation. The respondents viewed the chart with a brief description and were then asked, only half of the CHBA net zero and net zero ready labeled homes met or exceeded the envelope improvement target proposed for tier 5, which is greater than 40%. In your opinion, which envelope improvement target would adequately represent net zero energy ready? We see that many respondents view the proposed tier 5 code envelope percentage improvement as being too high. Some felt that it was about right, and a few did feel it was a little too low. Following this, we moved on to the energy tier in the survey, again with a brief description of the chart beforehand. The question asked here was, just over 1 in 4 CHBA net zero and net zero ready labeled homes met or exceeded the energy improvement target proposed for tier 5, which is greater than 70% currently. In your opinion, which energy improvement target would adequately represent net zero energy ready? Highlighted on the bar chart in lighter green, we see that 65% felt that the energy target was too high, and 26% felt that it was about right. And then there were 9% felt it wasn't stringent enough. This shows a relatively similar breakdown to the envelope chart previous. Lastly, we gathered opinions from the builders on the cooling criteria. They viewed that chart that we analyzed earlier in this presentation, and we asked them this question. It is possible for a home with a large absolute peak cooling load to pass because it is slightly less than its reference house, and a home with a low absolute peak cooling load to fail because it is slightly higher than its reference house. Many CHBA net zero and net zero ready labeled homes do not meet this criteria. Do you feel that this cooling criteria should be? And the available answers for them were relaxed to allow a higher cooling load, to remain as currently proposed, or tightened to require an even lower cooling load, or take a totally different approach, or lastly, be removed altogether. 3 of the categories say a similar thing in our opinion, that what has been proposed for cooling isn't viewed as an effective approach currently. That's why I've colored these 3 categories in the same shade of green. Here, for simplicity, with the same chart, I brought all 3 of those groups together to show that 62% of respondents feel that the cooling criteria should be either relaxed, revised, or removed. In comparison, 30% of participants felt it was about right, and 8% of participants thought it could be tightened even to be a little more stringent. Before we highlight these findings, let's remember that these are the views of the net zero builders who have experience building high performance net zero homes. The views of the general CHBA membership may be even stronger. 55% of net zero builders feel the code envelope requirement for tier 5 is too stringent. 65% of the net zero builders feel the code energy requirement for tier 5 is too stringent. 62% of net zero builders feel the cooling criteria goes too far or takes the wrong approach.
We don't want to just identify a problem without offering options for moving forward. So we've taken a look at some areas in more detail. Based on the data we have presented, it seems reasonable to conclude that the current tier 5 requirements are not a close match to CHBA net zero ready homes. These homes provide the best available data to determine what net zero ready performance looks like in terms of the code metrics. There appears to be something of a sweet spot in energy and envelope performance slightly below the current tier 5 target, which is a common strategy for builders to get to net zero ready. CHBA net zero builders, who are the industry leaders, agree that tier 5 goes too far and ought to align with CHBA's net zero ready labeling program. So, where should the tier 5 requirements move to? Deciding what proportion of net zero ready homes should meet tier 5 for it to be considered representative is quite subjective, but most people would probably agree that it should be more than 9%. If we relaxed each of the 3 requirements a little, that compliant proportion would increase. The table shows the current Tier 5 requirements and 3 combinations of relaxed requirements. The right column of the table shows what proportion of all the analysed net zero ready homes would comply with each option. For example, if you felt that over 60% meeting Tier 5 was enough, you might consider relaxing the envelope requirements to 30%, the energy requirement to 60%, and the cooling limit to no more than 10% over the reference house. Most of the remaining homes that would not meet Tier 5 are failing on the cooling requirement. This begs the question, are we setting the right cooling requirement? Given that 44% of the CHBA net zero ready homes did not meet any tier because they failed on the cooling requirement, and since the cooling criteria is not an integral aspect of net zero energy as a concept, it seems that this is an area worth paying more attention to. As part of our survey, we asked our net zero builders about their experiences with overheating in their net zero ready homes. 24% indicated that one or more of their homes had some issue with overheating. Most net zero ready homes have air conditioning provided at sale and are unlikely to overheat. Although not a majority, it is clear that some overheating is occurring, and it would be helpful to have an effective means to limit the issues. There is one aspect of the cooling requirement that may not be obvious, as mentioned in the survey question. These 4 sets of data represent 4 homes in the net zero data set. The 2 on the left, with relatively high cooling loads in blue, meet the cooling criteria by being lower than the reference house load in orange, while the 2 on the right, with relatively low cooling loads, fail because the reference cooling load is even lower. Home 2 could have passed with a cooling load much higher, almost as high as Home 1, which is twice as big. Home 4 may have been able to meet the cooling load with an adjustment to the window to wall ratio or the solar heat gain coefficient, but that may not be the case for Home 3, which has a bigger difference. Home 3 is also more than twice the size of Home 4, but has only a slightly higher cooling limit. This seems to indicate that the proposed peak cooling criteria is counterproductive where the goal is energy efficiency. Whether a home passes or fails appears arbitrary and unrelated to energy efficiency. We're going to look in a little more detail at the data to see if we can find an approach that could address overheating in the code. This graph shows the distribution of peak cooling loads with the total load in kilowatts on the x-axis and the number of homes with that load on the y-axis. 63% of homes had peak cooling less than 4 kilowatts, but most homes were also less than 1,000 meters cubed, so this might not be a fair limit for homes bigger than that. As you might expect, one of the main contributors to the cooling load is the volume of the house, so any absolute limit would be harder for larger homes to meet. Just for interest, we looked at how the distribution for the builders with over 10 net zero labels differed from this. The answer is not by much. This is not the same graph, it shows only the data for the builders with more than 10 labels, but it does look very similar. Next, we tried normalizing by house volume to get the cooling required per meter cubed. This time, the line represents the number of homes with the same cooling load per unit volume in watts per meter cubed. This might seem like a reasonable way to limit overheating by setting a normalized target at, say, 8 watts per meter cubed. But at small volumes, the cooling load in our data stops decreasing linearly and levels off, so the normalized figure is bigger. This suggests that small homes may struggle to meet a per meter cubed cooling requirement. To illustrate this, here's a scatter graph of per meter cubed cooling against house volume. You can see that a limit of around 8 watts per meter cubed might be reasonable for houses larger than 400 meters cubed, but below that volume, it might be hard to meet. It is not clear from our data whether the 6 homes circled are representative of a general trend or if their high cooling load per meter cubed might be attributable to other factors, but it is certainly something to look into further. In short, regulating cooling is complicated. The best option might be to accept homes meeting either of 2 targets, a total cooling load limit in kilowatts or a per volume target in watts per meter cubed or similar. A reference comparison may also have a place if the codes wish to accommodate houses with large glazed areas, which might otherwise struggle to meet these targets.
So with the information we've discussed so far, the major takeaways should fairly obviously be that, one, quantitatively, with respect to the data, net zero homes are not meeting tier 5, and two, qualitatively, with respect to the net zero builders survey, the industry leaders believe that tier 5 is too stringent. With those takeaways in mind, we need to take a serious look at the cost effectiveness of tier 5. And we know that discussing cost accurately are always tricky, so I'll reference a relatively straightforward cost optimization chart. Over the past 5 years, through the CHBA Net Zero Home Labeling Program, builders have been leveraging this voluntary program to help the industry find the sweet spot to net zero performance. The chart we have here represents an example of the general cost optimization process. Here, as a simple example, we are looking specifically at how increasing insulation impacts energy cost. As insulation costs increase, energy costs decrease until a certain point. That intersection of where the two lines meet is a sweet spot, or the cost optimization point. Beyond that point, we're into diminishing returns. We can think of the same cost optimization analysis with the insulation line as a surrogate for energy efficiency improvements, and the energy cost line representing the cost of on-site renewables required, most likely PV. The industry has already shown us where that sweet spot is with respect to net zero. When we look at where tier 5 is currently proposed, we are into the region known as diminishing returns. As we know, these diminishing returns are paid for by the home buyer. So to sum it up, though tier 5 was originally conceived as an equivalent to net zero ready, that aim does not appear to have been achieved. Relaxing the target slightly would be much more representative of typical net zero ready homes and lead to more effective solutions. Many net zero homes do not meet the cooling criteria, but they do not widely experience overheating because most have air conditioning. The proposed cooling criteria may not be the best way to limit overheating. Net zero builders, the industry leaders and innovators in energy efficiency, have indicated that tier 5 goes too far and should be revised to reflect the performance levels of homes in the net zero home labeling program. Voluntary energy efficiency programs have always played an important role in informing the path of the codes. We've seen a very consistent, and to my understanding, intentional pattern of the codes following behind the voluntary programs, allowing the voluntary programs to provide lessons learned and confidence in an approach before moving forward with code regulation. If it is in fact still the goal of tier 5 to sit at net zero ready performance level, we should very strongly consider what the market has shown us in making these before making these regulatory decisions. So we can move now to questions. We have quite a bit of time. So Sonia, are there any questions in the chat window?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, well, I started my video, but it doesn't seem to have come up, so I'm not quite sure what's.
I can see you as well, so it should be, it looks like we're going.
Great, okay, perfect. So we do have one question so far. Marius is asking, are you able to speak about the impact of location, so likely referring to climate zones, on the difficulty meeting the tier 5 requirements, both total energy improvement and envelope improvement? So Brett, I know we've done some work on that, so are you able to address that?
Yeah, we have done some work on that, and to no surprise, it seems that, and I can't quantify this right now without the data, but in general, it seems that the colder the climate zone, the more difficulty there is. We've also done some looking at the difference between where net zero currently sits and where tier 5 is, and the potential changes to go from net zero to that step up to where we're seeing to tier 5 is at. And again, it seems that climate zone 4 has only a few steps to get there, whereas climate zone 7A or 7B has quite a bit more steps to get there. So it seems that in general, that the colder the climate, the more difficulty or more challenging it would be to get to the tier levels.
Great, thanks so much, Brett. I don't know, Liz, if you wanted to chime in on that as well.
I just wanted to say we haven't had the chance to look in as much detail as we would like, and we probably will later at the location-specific aspects. But I can say from memory that builders who are building in one specific location were still having a fair amount of spread between one building and another, and especially in the cooling load, it was a good mixture for any given builder in most cases, whether they passed or failed.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. We have a few more questions coming in now. So we've got Brandon asking, I fail to understand why we are still trying to optimize the design of net zero energy homes when it is obvious the goal should be the life cycle, least cost design of fully electric homes. So that seems to be more of a statement than a question. I don't know if either of you want to reply to that.
Yeah, on a personal standpoint, I don't disagree. We're simply working with what the codes have provided us, and we know that they're looking at energy efficiency right now, so we're comparing our energy efficiency program to what their goals are.
So it's important to note that the codes are meant to be energy agnostic, so it should be possible to meet it with gas as well as with electricity, and indeed with oil or propane or any of the other sources. So given that, we felt that it was necessary to look at what was actually achievable under those limitations, which is what net zero is doing.
Great, thank you so much. Richard is asking, have you considered lessons from BC's STEP code? As of this year, a number of local jurisdictions have already mandated STEP 5, which is intended to be the BC code level in 2032.
Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit. We haven't done a specific analysis such as this, comparing CHBA net zero to the BC STEP code. We've only compared CHBA net zero to the NBC code tiers. I can say we have heard anecdotally that the situation seems to be similar. From a handful of our energy advisors in British Columbia say that most of their net zero energy homes seem to align at the top end of tier 4. Some of them do spill into, step 4. Some of them do spill into tier 5. So anecdotally, a similar analysis, but no hard data at this point or an analysis to this detail.
I could also add that the STEP code was looked at in the development of the NBC tier code, but they felt that there were limitations to the approach using intensity, which, as mentioned earlier in our presentation, means that you don't necessarily get a direct comparison between different software. And so it was felt that the percentage improvement was the way to go in the national code.
Thank you so much. Al is asking, could the variations within the climate zone be attributable to house archetype differences?
It's possible. We had a pretty true spread in the 447 homes we looked at in comparison to our house forms in terms of single family detached versus attached products. We haven't looked at this time, and I would certainly like to look at an even deeper analysis, looking at the complexity, number of corners, volume. So I would like to take a deeper analysis at the form and include the climate zones as well, but it hasn't been done at this time beyond, as I said, generally single family detached versus attached.
So it's also important to note that that level of detail wasn't available in the data set that we were provided with by NRCan. So in order to get that kind of information, it would require another deep dive into looking at the actual files that we have.
Great. Yeah, maybe we can take a look at doing that next year with more homes. All right, wonderful. Jason is asking, do you know how the tier 5 cooling requirements without mechanical cooling, so annual and peak, compare with passive house cooling requirements?
I'm not familiar with the passive house cooling requirements. I'm not sure, Liz, if that's come up in the code meetings or if you can speak to that at all.
Could I get Sonia to repeat the question? Sorry.
Sure. Do you know how the tier 5 cooling requirements without mechanical cooling, so annual and peak, compare with passive house cooling requirements?
The short answer is no, not really. I imagine some people from NRCan might be able to provide more information on that, but I will say that our experience, there were some homes in our data set that also had a passive house label, and I think they actually had quite high cooling loads. So I don't know that passive house is automatically going to be the answer to this.
Thank you so much. Rizwan is asking, are there any studies available comparing CHBA's net zero ready performance with other relevant industry programs?
Not.
Maybe Rizwan could tell us.
Yeah. I was going to say not out of the CHBA that I know of. We do an annual report on our program each year. This is the first time we've compared it to, I guess this is not another program, but another set of criteria. But no, I haven't seen the programs compared in any reports. I'd love to if there are any reports out there.
Yeah, I guess my answer too would be we don't know of any other residential net zero ready program out there. I think the closest one might be Passive House, but the other programs do have levels. Like I know Built Green has a platinum level. So I don't know if there's necessarily one that that we could potentially directly correspond to and that has enough volume numbers that would be statistically relevant. So I mean, we could do some looking around, but if you've got some suggestions, let us know. Although I did get a text, I think someone is sending me some answers here. Let me just continue with the questioning. Okay, we've got Andy is asking, have you identified in the current reference house assumptions in 936, for example, achieve 0.5 air tightness, I guess, on all homes and assumed window solar heat gain coefficient of 0.26? Have you identified if that current house reference assumptions have an impact on our analysis?
I'm not sure I fully caught the whole question, but if it's talking about whether the reference house is affecting the outcome, then of course it is, because whatever the reference house is and how that performs will have an impact on how much improvement you get. I'm not sure beyond that how much information I can give on that at the moment.
So I'm guessing he's wondering if we've identified, so I'm going to see if Andy's added some more. Oh, 2.5 air change, so it wasn't in 2.5. Okay, so I think maybe the question is whether or not the 2.5 air changes in the solar heat gain coefficient, do we know how much of that is having an impact on the analysis?
So we haven't quantified that, and it would be quite difficult for us to do it with the data that we actually currently have, but it might be something worth exploring further. I would say, I know what Andy is getting at with the air tightness thing. There are some questions about whether 2.5 in the reference house is the appropriate number. And also, in our experience, the solar heat gain that is assumed in the reference house is very low. And that may be making it harder for the cooling criteria to be met as well. I don't have data on how much it affects it and how significant a problem that is at the moment, though.
Okay, so perhaps that's something we could, again, also look a little bit more deeply into, depending on whether or not there's further interest for us to do that in comparison to what's going on with the code development at this time. Okay, we have Keith asking, how much does orientation affect the ability to deal with cooling loads? Lots of windows on the south side would increase cooling load, but orientation can't be changed. How do volume builders deal with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if Liz has further to add to this. We haven't specifically had the time to look at that. We can assume that there would be differences, and we know of that concern. Don't know if NRCan was working on that or not. I may remember they may have mentioned they are. Liz, do you have anything to add on that?
I know that in digging into the data, I believe I have seen some homes that have like identical volumes, and I assume that the only difference is likely to be the orientation. And in that situation, one house was passing the cooling criteria and the other one was failing. So it could make quite a big difference. I wonder if that would still be the case if you allowed for 5 to 10% over, as we suggested might be an option. So the things that you can change to affect the cooling criteria, as far as we can tell, are the window to wall ratio and the solar heat gain coefficient. You can play around with some other things, but those are probably going to be the things that have the biggest effect. And I know that's not as simple as it sounds, because your home buyers will want to have large glazed areas, and sometimes solar heat gain coefficients are quite expensive to change. But those do seem to be the most effective options. One limitation of the reference house from some perspectives is that it distributes the glazing area over all 4 sides, which means the orientation doesn't really affect the reference house, but it does affect the proposed house. And where orientation is not something you can change, that maybe does seem quite unfair.
I know I have heard from a small handful of builders that the ones where they do have a large amount of glazing, even sometimes in an east-west scenario, depending on time of year, even the shoulder seasons, the east-west can also do some overheating or potentially add to overheating. That some of them have actually tried some longer overhangs or deeper overhangs, I guess, and as well some other shading strategies. So I think in the cases where they're aware that it could potentially be a problem, that they've tried to address it through a couple of different ways. So I think the builders are getting creative when they realize that there could potentially be an issue. And of course, comfort is a big issue for that. And then also just heard on the FenCan webinar that was just this morning that also glare is a potential comfort issue as well. So things to be aware of, that the builders are wanting to make sure the homeowners are comfortable in those aspects. So that was for Keith. So Terry is also asking something to do with window to wall ratio here. It says, it appeared the data didn't show much concern for overheating / cooling loads, yet we see a number of groups looking at high solar gain glazing, window to wall ratio, orientation as potential concerns for overheating being an issue. Is there something in the data missing?
I think we did have quite a lot of analysis on the overheating and did look at some different solutions. Maybe I'm not understanding the question right, but we did, talk about, Liz had some proposed ideas with the watts per meter cubed as an option for cooling, and another option for larger homes. So
what I would say is that I don't think the data that we have, and I'm not sure that energy modeling in general is capable of actually telling you that overheating will occur. It can tell you what the cooling load will be, but I don't think there is currently a check that says, yep, this house is going to be vulnerable. It's not been clearly defined how that actually comes about. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it maybe explains why we can't.
Yeah, absolutely. So my suggestion would be, I think, Terry, if you'd like to have a chat with us afterwards offline, we could dig into some information in a bit more detail. We're always more than happy to talk about these things and get some insight from industry players. So Terry, feel free to reach out to us as well. Simon is asking, do you intend at some point to look at embodied carbon and the total life cycle of those houses to see if they compare between themselves? Like, does it vary a lot between them, but also compared to regular houses?
So in the net zero program, we are still focusing on energy as our main driver. We certainly have our eyes on carbon, as we know that's likely where the industry is headed. But right now, in terms of our definite technical requirements, it's focused on energy. I do know that most of our qualified net zero builders and renovators are very aware of embodied carbon and are doing their best to make smart decisions in the carbon space. But currently, no, we're still focused on energy.
And the same is true of the codes. There have been a number of requests from various parties that the codes start to consider carbon, either operational or embodied. But at the present, the organization that tells us what in codes we can and cannot pursue has decided that carbon is not something that they want to be addressing at the moment. They want to be focused on energy. So that is what the codes have to do at the moment.
And I'd like to add to that, the role of voluntary programs really is to allow those industry leaders to find the best way to do things. So as you would anticipate, those who are participating in the Net Zero Home Labeling Program are also the same builders who are very keen to explore this very topic and have expressed interest to NRCan's LEAP team to test out the new carbon calculator that's been developed, which shows both operational carbon as well as embodied carbon. So you'll see probably the same suspects as you usually would in these voluntary programs, giving that a kick at the can and just seeing, you know, how that how the results of that carbon calculator would potentially influence the decisions that they make on the material choices in their homes. So I have no doubt that we'll start to see some information coming out in that space. And once we have more information available to us, then we would, you know, be able to bring that kind of data back to the technical committee and see whether or not it's something that is valid to include in our program. So until we have more data, there's not much we can do. Let's see here. With the proposed tier 5 level appearing to potentially be difficult to attain, what is CHBA's plan to bring these issues up to the Codes Committee or the Commission? I think, Liz, you have an answer for that one.
Well, I think a number of those people are actually on this webinar. So that's one way. And I would also say that we will probably be sharing this webinar with all of those people and bringing our findings up at each opportunity that arises. I'm not the person who does the strategy for how our work on this goes, so I can't speak in detail about it, but I believe that this is going to become part of our platform.
Great, thank you so much, Liz. Brandon also wanted to just make a clarification that both reference and proposed homes are modeled with the same orientation. So that just kind of closes a bit of the loop on one of the previous questions. We have another, I think this is more of a comment. NRCan is working on a solution reference house window distribution and the prescribed solar heat gain coefficient of 0.26. We will engage CHBA once we have a proposal. Sounds good, thank you. Brett and Liz, very well done. You've shown some valid concerns and provided some reasonable solutions. Thanks so much, Andy. Richard, Passive House has stressed the beneficial aspects of solar gains, but overheating is a problem. Even in cloudy Vancouver, a couple of Passive House projects are having significant overheating problems. I guess I would just say that we've heard the same thing on this side. I think Brett had already brought that up. So we're hearing the same things from builders who've done both net zero and Passive House. Thanks for that information, Richard. And Jason is asking, was thought given to whether HOT 2000 software inherently treats small versus larger volume houses differently with respect to cooling load calculations, i.e. comparatively penalizes smaller volume houses? I think that was addressed in the analysis, right, Liz? I
think so. So just as a fundamental part of the way that HOT 2000 does it, it's kind of inevitable that it's going to work out that way, I think, and I'm not an expert on the details of exactly how HOT 2000 works, but I don't think we're likely to be moving away from HOT 2000 anytime soon. So we probably need to work out how to make the existing tools work for what we want them to do, rather than hope that we can fix the tools.
And Brett, I think you have some more insight into that as well, right?
Yeah, and I do know that, I mean, when we looked at the data specifically, we did see some of the small houses struggling to meet some of the proposed targets we have. And that's true for any energy targets you propose as well, aside from just cooling. So it is a consideration for sure. And I think it's It's addressed currently in the codes with the 300 meter cubed threshold that they have in place. We're looking at only the tiers above 300 meters cubed, but there's some changes below with respect to envelope and energy.
You say that it's addressed. I would perhaps say there is an attempt to address it. I'm not sure yet how effective that attempt will be.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We do have one last comment here. OBC, TGS, and VBBL have operational GHG limits for part 3. Not sure about part 9. I'm going to say I've never heard any of that for part 9. I don't know if anyone else has heard of that. No. Okay, yeah, we haven't heard anything on this end. So my guess is that part 9, we don't have any of those limits, GHG limits. So thanks for bringing that to our attention, Brandon. So that's it for our questions. Thank you so much, Brett and Liz, for a fantastic presentation. As always, if anyone has any questions or wants to set up a time to talk about these results with us in any further detail, please do reach out to me and I can set up some meetings. But I guess aside from that, we are done our presentation for today, and we would like to wish you enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you on our next webinar. Bye for now, everyone.